Bones are how you get things to move inside of anime with a character or props, move very specifically with rotation and connectivity. In this movie, we'll take a look at a very general approach to binding because there are three primary ways to connect your bones to the objects in your scene. There's not a right or wrong way, it's which way works best for the particular scene or item that you've got. This first area we'll take a look at is binding right here. I've created half a character to save a little bit of time and demonstrate how this works. Now, inside of Anime Studio Pro documentation, you will not find something called area binding. This is a term I'm using, and it covers two methods that are covered inside of Anime, and that is flexible binding and region binding. I'm going to double click on this layer. This calls up the layer settings, and under Bones, we'll see binding mode, flexible and region. Flexible is always on by default because it's the most, well, it's a general, very broad movement tool. When flexible binding is engaged, let me go ahead and click OK. I'll grab my bone manipulation tool, and this entire construction of bones is called a rig. We'll cover that in more detail later, so don't worry about that, and we'll talk about how these connect. But when I grab the head bone, for example, and move it, we see the other items around it deforming a little bit. If I grab the chest and move it, there's a nice connectivity. Everything looks like, yeah, it's wired together. But we do see things like the arm here. Look, it starts to deform a little bit. It gets smaller, it stretches out. This is flexible binding. By contrast, let's go ahead and compare region binding. I'll open this option up again. We'll go to Bones and come to Region and choose OK. Now, region binding means, and we've seen a shape change, this area of color around each bone is the bone strength. When I click the bone strength tool over here, we see we have an option of 1, we can set it to 0, we can set it to 2. This tool allows you to dynamically get in here. I'll click on the scene and drag left, and we see this one color field getting larger as I go right, smaller as I go left. If we do Command A or Control A to select all the bones, we can do all of them simultaneously. Region binding means that the only things affected in the scene, the drawn areas, are what are underneath the region of this color. So when I come back to my bone manipulation tool right now, I'll click off this. When I grab the head doesn't distort a whole lot. And you'll notice now that when I move my character, bones are connected, which is grabbing these other items underneath. However, this lower arm is no longer distorting the way it used to with flexible binding. So the region underneath this strength is what's being affected by the bones. So let me turn this off. I'll come up to layer binding. We'll enable that by clicking on the eyes in the layer palette. Now, layer binding is just that. When I disclose this layer, we see that for each item in the scene, I actually have a separate layer drawn. To make layer binding work, we go ahead and turn off all of the bone strength. Since these are all selected right now, I'm going to click and drag all the way to the left. We see that we've got bone strength set to 0. And here's how layer binding works. Notice our bone tools over here in the upper left. We're going to see a tool now that we haven't seen before when I click on the vector layer underneath that. Here's head. The points for the head light up, and when we come over to the bone tools on the left, we'll see that we've got a new one. We've got the layer binding tool, bind layer, and then we've got a bind point. I'm going to click on the bind layer tool here. All the bones deselect, and what I do now with head selected is choose which bone is going to influence this. Well, I want the bone right by the head. We can do the same thing for neck, chest, then I'll do upper and lower arms just so we can see how they work together. With that done, when I grab the top layer here, layer binding, come over to the bones palette on the left. When I grab the head bone and move it, it moves by itself. Now there is a process going on called inverse kinematics where the bones are connected together. We'll learn about that when we get into the rigging section. But notice nothing's deforming. There's some motion in the neck. The neck isn't deforming. Likewise, when I grab the neck, the head moves real nicely, but the chest area is not deforming. When I grab the chest and move it, the arms are moving, but they're not deforming. And then I can grab regions like this. So it's a nice way to get broad motion into your scene very easily. The last one we'll take a look at is point binding. Let me turn off our layer, and we'll come and turn on our point binding layer. Just like with the layer binding, we need to reduce the bone strength because we don't want to have this affecting as well as the points that we work with. So we'll come to our bone strength tool. I'll do Command A or Control A on the PC, click and drag left. The bone strength goes all the way down. Now when we select the areas underneath this, the different layers, for example, head, I can come over here to my bone tools on the left, and I'll click off all the bones and say, well, here's what we'll do. I want to select this bone. Now when I come to the Bind Points tool, I select which points in the head I want to be affected by this. So in this case, well, for clarity, let's say, I'm just going to grab the top points right here. Now this tool requires you to validate the selection by pressing the space bar. Now when I come down to the neck layer, you'll notice the head bone is still selected and all the points on the neck highlight, but I may only want the top ones selected right here to have any effect when the head bone is moved. So I choose those, press the space bar, and now for demonstration, when I come back to the point binding area, when I grab the bone manipulation tool and move this head bone, the neck is deforming slightly at the top to match, but nothing else is. So the point binding function is to finesse very small motions and keep things from close like tearing or coming apart on the body. So we go from really coarse movement with the area binding to selected specific movement with layer binding, and then fine-tune movement with point binding.